Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about our friend the Virtual Boy, perhaps the most infamous platform that Nintendo ever released. And not necessarily infamous because it was so successful and glorious and everybody remembers it fondly, but infamous because sadly it has become something of a punchline over the course of time. But at least lately, its reputation has gone up and it's gotten more of a cult following. And I wanted to acknowledge it very much so on its 30th birthday. And we're gonna talk all about our friend, the Nintendo Virtual Boy. Before we do that, though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, my travel channel, etc. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you so much. Let's get into it. So, Nintendo and the Virtual Boy. It is 30 years old, which is kind of an interesting one to think about for two reasons. One, I sort of screwed up the anniversary date here. The system actually launched in Japan on July 21st, 1995. I intended to do this video for that date, but due to scheduling conflicts, I was simply unable to complete this in time. However, the North American launch, of course, which was the US and Canada, was August 14th, 1995. And I've decided I'm going to release it before that one. So it's just the 30th anniversary. But the difference here between the Virtual Boy and the other anniversary videos I've done, last year I talked about like the Saturn, 32X, PS1, PSP, DS, etc. Not a whole lot of people have nostalgic memories of the Virtual Boy. It's a lot of people who, some do, certainly. Shout out to our friend of the channel, Virtual Girl Candace, who is like the Virtual Boy fan of the internet. She would have nostalgic memories. Me, much like most of us, didn't really have access to it as a child, outside of one memory, which I'll discuss with you later. But I still wanted to go back and talk about it and look at it. And this is not to be confused with one of my Generation Recap videos. This is really just us talking about something on its birthday, because I just think it would be fun. So, with that said, we'll go into it. It's going to be a little bit of history, a little bit of games, a little bit of legacy, just an overall fun little chat. Grab a drink, let's go. So, here's the basic origin of how the Nintendo Virtual Boy came into existence. Now, I forget the name of the company, but there was this company that was basically developing faux 3D lens technology by using two LCD screens basically put together and then just kind of blocking out other imagery would basically trick the human brain into the illusion of 3D. Now, they brought this kind of early tech to a bunch of toy companies. I don't know which companies offhand, but I would guess things like Hasbro, Mattel, etc. And nobody bit. So they were like, well, what do we do now? And they tried their hand at video game companies, thinking, maybe they would be interested. They tried Sega, who turned them down, but then they went to Nintendo. Now, Nintendo did not pass, but the reason they didn't, I think, is because the person they spoke with was very infamously Gunpei Yokoi. He was best known for being the guy who effectively not only created the Game & Watch line of content, but also effectively the father of the Game Boy. Now, because of those successes, he kind of had carte blanche at Nintendo to really just do anything at that point, especially in hardware. So they meet with him, and he likes the tech. He looks at it, gets excited about it, and he sees potential in it. He says, like, this isn't there yet, but the idea of 3D gaming really would open up all sorts of doors for video game developers to do new things that just simply weren't possible with, two dimensions. And he would ultimately be proven correct with that, by the way, because the 3DS was a massive success. And we would see that big 3D burst after Avatar came out in 2009 with 3D TVs, which has largely since died down. But point is that the market and the idea was there. It was more about execution that was important. So because he had the power he had, he decided to buy out the patent outright from them in Nintendo's behalf. And I believe he spent like $5 million to take ownership of that content. And then him and his team were off. He wanted to do R&D, he wanted to refine things, make it better, and so they started working on all that. They would do things that would address issues that had run on the Game Boy, such as the screen on the Game Boy was fine, even though it was monochrome, but when games were running too quickly, characters would blur. They wanted to address issues like that. They're engineers. They just wanted to refine the problems that had existed before, right, while working with new technology. So while they're in development on this, completely separate from them, outside of that bubble of creation, there's a lot of external factors. Namely that in 1994, their primary competitor, Sega, had launched a bunch of new hardware. The 32X and the Sega Saturn had both actually, technically speaking, come out on the exact same day already. and they were entered full into the next generation of hardware. Then you had some of their other potential competitors. The Sony PlayStation had already launched in Japan, and there had been other 5th-gen consoles that some had admittedly very much not succeeded, but they had come into existence. Meanwhile, Nintendo was sitting there with we still have the Super Nintendo, which had come out effectively in 1990 in Japan, so it had been a minute. They had nothing really in the pipeline as far as the Game Boy, was not going anywhere. They didn't have the Game Boy Color and would not have it until I think 98 or 99. And the N64, as we would know it, would not be ready for quite a while, although it was in development at that point, but absolutely in its infancy. So there was big pressure within Nintendo to get a new machine out there in a very short-sighted mentality, which, if you ask me, is really what doomed this platform. Because the mentality was, if all of our competitors are making new hardware and they're all out there and they're in the media cycle and Nintendo's just we still have old stuff, we're going to lose people's interests. So to that end, a decision was made that they needed to get something out there. And when they looked around, they realized the only thing they had that was even remotely close to release was the Virtual Boy as it was at that point in time. So the order came down, we got to release the Virtual Boy. Gunpei Yokoi, in a Japanese way, protested, more or less saying he didn't think it was ready, but he would do what was best for the interest of the company's desires, etc. So there's a rumor for a long time about so these things have red screens, monochrome red. Now, I've heard it both directions. I don't know which is true, but the story goes, in some instances, that was a design choice just to make the thing cheaper to produce rather than having a full color palette. And then others say that it was just because it was a prototype. They were just working with one color for the time being until they could add it later. Either way, it released with just a single red shade. And they really owned that by making the device itself actually red. We'll talk a little bit more about the device and its usage in a bit. But yeah, so it comes out, again, in Japan on July 21st, 1995, and the US and Canada on August 14th, 1995, and was not an immediate success. In fact, it would never become a success. So basically, there was really nobody kicking down doors trying to get this thing. Even though it had Nintendo's name on it, kind of nobody really cared. And I think part of the problem with that was just it was kind of impossible to demo it to anybody. It wasn't something you could easily hand over to someone if you already owned one. They'd have to spend the time to get the rig together and really get into it and try it. And it just kind of had this antisocial vibe because you're just supposed to stick your face in there and just be disconnected from the world. Meanwhile, even Nintendo themselves didn't really know how to advertise it. I think it was Nintendo of America put down a $20 million ad campaign to make people aware of this thing, and still people didn't really check it out. The commercials, you could make commercials about the Virtual Boy, but the problem is the whole idea was it's 3D content. But even in the commercials, there was no way to illustrate that. You more or less had to just look at this red and black screen and believe that it's going to be in 3D because your TV couldn't support that. So they ran into that same issue that even I, as a YouTuber, run into now in 2025, which is no real proper way to capture footage off this thing. Even if you have direct access to the ROM and you can just rip the software, you still can't display it in a means that is it properly illustrates the device's capacity. So one thing that Nintendo did do is here in the United States, and this might have been true in Canada, I'm not sure. Maybe they did a variant of this in Japan at a different chain, but here they partnered with Blockbuster. Now, I was a big proponent of Blockbuster. Shout out to the last one in Bend, Oregon. And in those Blockbusters, they did a deal where they basically set up a kiosk. And in the kiosk, you could go to Blockbuster and just play it. You could play the Virtual Boy right there and try it out and see what the technology was all about. That way you didn't have to rely on your friend. You didn't have to trust the marketing necessarily. You just played it and thought, got a sense of what you think. Now, I know I did that. I know I did that once. And I just have a very faded memory of going into one of the Blockbusters and doing that. And I don't know what game I played. I would imagine it probably was Mario Tennis. But I remember playing it for a second and coming away with a headache very quickly. And at the time, I wore glasses. I've since had laser corrective surgery for that. But at the time, I wore glasses, and they really just were an immediate, this doesn't even fit, it's uncomfortable, and it just felt like having, red lights just shining in my eyes, like one of those laser pointers. And so I was like, dame, no want. So I never got into this thing, and I think that was the only time I tried it until I was an adult. Ironically, I now quite enjoy it, but that's because certain elements have been changed. But It seems like a lot of people felt the same way. I have really never known anybody who had one as a child, except I think potentially Virtual Girl Candace. Aside from her, I don't think I know anybody who ever really had one of these as a kid. Because again, by the end of its lifespan, it was discontinued in March of 1996. It didn't even last a full year collectively. And it only had about 22 titles released, if I recall correctly, selling about 800,000 units globally. And famously never had a release in Europe or Australia. And I could be wrong, but I think it was just literally 3 countries that ever had an official release in, which was Japan, the US, and Canada. Although if there's another country, like I don't know if it had a release in Mexico as associated with North America or something, or maybe there was a limited Hong Kong release as associated with Japan, even though it's obviously not Japanese. You know what I'm trying to say. Regionally. But I don't actually know that. So the ones I do know is just those 3. But yeah, it comes out, it fails, and Nintendo kind of sweeps it under the rug and more or less pretends like it has never happened. And to this day, they barely acknowledge it. Sadly, when the 3DS came along, that really was proof that Gunpei Yokoi was right in concept, but basically that the corporate overlords with short-sightedness really killed that for them and more or less killed his career. He effectively was forced to resign from Nintendo after that, given a room with a view, as they say. And then he headed off and he made the Wonder Swan and sadly died shortly after that. But anyway, so the system, you know, the idea was good, but execution was simply poor just due to various factors that you really can't blame Gunpei Yokoi for, but they still did anyway because his name was on it. Anywho, so these days it's kind of an interesting thing because it has really resurfaced as this thing that people aren't really nostalgic for because they didn't have it in the first place, but that they've shown much more respect for because of what it tried to do and the fact that it's an official Nintendo system and it's just such an oddity. I mean, that's really kind of why I liked it much later in life. You know, I personally got one. I got this boxed one in Japan only a couple of years ago. It works really well, and I've got a bunch of games for it. But you know, you look at it, it looks like a robot or something, or sometimes like goggles. It's strange, man. Like, it has to have these legs on for it to get to an acceptable height. I think one of the issues with the Virtual Boy is a lot of people complain about headaches or back posture or whatever. You really, really have to set it up to the exact right dimensions of your face and like be in a comfortable position when you're playing it. You also can't, to be honest, can't really have vision problems. That was something I learned as a child. If you have, at the time, vision problems, then it's just painful to interact with. Sorry if you're hearing sirens outside. I live centrally located between a police station, a fire department, and a hospital, so it can be any one of the 3 at any random time. Always a fun time here. But anyway, so the controller would plug into the side here. The controller is actually how you provided power. There were 2 options. There was a battery pack, and then there was an official like Super Nintendo style power supply you just plug in. That's my preferred method. There was a link cable port, which was never officially used. The cartridges look very similar to Game Boy games, which makes sense. But it really is like the lost brother of the Game Boy line. And only recently, again, has Nintendo even really acknowledged it with at least some support in the museum in Kyoto. They at least now sell Virtual Boy merch, and they acknowledge, yeah, we made that thing. It is a shame, though, that they never decided to do a Virtual Boy collection for the 3DS. Like, that was just free money. I will say this, though. Hackers and the fan community really did a good job with that. There is an emulator for the 3DS once your 3DS is hacked where it can actually run the Virtual Boy games, and it's beautiful. It's like the way to play it. It's like you can see what developers were going for, where they weren't actually limited by the obvious restraints that existed within the Virtual Boy itself. The games are good, the hardware was meh. That's kind of the basic lesson there. Now, when it comes to the games, I actually have most of them, which is kind of funny because I never really intended to. Where this all started was I ended up getting a bunch of games in Japan once. So I've been to Japan a bunch of times. And one of the times I was there, I was in a book off. And I just checked out the clearance section. And they had like 4 boxed Virtual Boy games that were equivalents of like 50 cents a piece. And I was like, that'd be kind of dumb to pass on that, right? So I just grabbed them, and that kind of started a little bit of an addiction where I was like, well, I should get more. And then eventually I actually got the hardware. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these games. First, we've got Mario Tennis. This is the American release. This is by far the most common game on the system. This was packed in with the system in North America. However, it was sold separately in Japan, hence the box there. And I've got both because the box. This is another one. This was like 50 cents to have the box at the time. And so it was pretty cool to have. However, it's worth noting there is actually an American box for this thing. I don't remember exactly what the story of it is, but if I recall correctly, it was when Blockbuster did the promo with this thing and you could rent the platform from them. When Nintendo provided those units, they also wanted to provide the game, but they provided the game the way you're supposed to, which is you send it fully boxed. So to that effect, they made a fully boxed standalone release of Mario Tennis for North America, only shipped to Blockbusters. And then, if your Blockbuster happened to be like, didn't discard the box and chose to sell it for whatever reason, then you could get it. So I've seen that box a couple of times in real life. It's very expensive. It's like a few $100s just for the box, just because technically it's part of the North American set. I don't think even Virtual Girl owns one of those, but I could be wrong. That said, it's not. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's the Blockbuster deal, but again, I could be wrong about that. Okay, moving on. We got Red Alarm. I've got both the American version here and the Japanese one, which is called Virtual 3D Shooting Game. I'm sure it has an actual name I can't read, but that's the only part I can read is Virtual 3D Shooting Game. And then for another crossover here, we have Panic Bomber, and I've got the Japanese version, which has a much nicer box, or an actual box in this case. But yeah, it's basically just Bomberman. One of the things that is unfortunate about this system is how Nintendo was so defensive and protective of the 3D tech in it that they basically didn't allow most third-party developers to have competent access to it. They would give it kind of limited. And as a result, most of them couldn't really dive into it. And I think that really hurt it, because most of the games that produced for it were produced by Nintendo themselves, because it was their actual hardware. And third-party devs were more or less demotivated to do it. And it didn't help that it had certain other limitations in it just by the nature of the way it worked. It had a 32-bit processor in it that was actually very capable, but it effectively had to run 2 separate screens simultaneously, more or less cutting the power in half. And without sufficient knowledge of the hardware, because Nintendo was so protective of it, few devs really got into it. And it had such a comically short lifespan anyway, it's kind of hard to know like how far they could have really pushed it. Maybe the fan community will one day do that, which they have been doing some stuff, but anyway, we'll get back to that. A few other box games here. We got V Tetris, not to be confused with 3D Tetris. There's actually 2 different Tetris games on this thing. We've got Galactic Pinball. These are Japanese versions from here on out, because I own a couple of other American ones, but for the most part my stuff's Japanese just because it's so much cheaper over there. Teleboxer. This is kind of an interesting one. It's like a cool like virtual boxing game. This one actually shows the tech off pretty well. Then we have a golf game. I know this came out in the US, but I don't remember. Actually, it's funny. This one, along with the Japanese version of Red Alarm, as well as V Tetris and Mario Clash. I was in Japan last year, and there was basically a big surplus of these, like new old stock of those games. Panic Bomber 2, I think. Maybe. But those for sure. New old stock of these games was found and was just dumped into a bunch of Suragayas, which is a chain over there of video game stores. And so you can actually get these games, some of these really cheap now, because there was just tons of new old stock. So you probably see them online, and they just like minty. It's from the same stockpile that somebody found. We have Virtual Fishing, Space Squash, Vertical Force. This was another one that I think they found a ton of new old stock for this. Vertical Force is a shoot 'em up though. Mario Clash was one of them, though this is the most sought after of those. I found this in Japan as one of those new old stock copies, which is why it's in like real good condition. This is a fun game. This is like an homage, if you will, to the original Mario Brothers, not the NES one, like the arcade one that was on the Atari 2600 and all that stuff. It's like that, like the sequel to that almost. It's a pretty fun game actually. And then probably the prize of my Japanese game collection here is Jack Bros. I have the boxed version. This game is really good. I have never been a fan of like the Persona stuff. I got nothing against it. It was just never my thing. But Jack Bros. Is by far the most infamous game on the Virtual Boy. As far as legacy goes, it's not the most expensive one, but it is the most infamous, I would say. And there is an American release of this. The American release of this is ludicrously expensive. Now, famously, the Japanese release was always much cheaper, which is why guys like me would go ahead and get that. Now, what was really cool about this game, this was not discovered until like a year or two ago. Somebody figured out that within the code of this game, they basically just used the exact same ROM between the American and Japanese release, and they just more or less switched something between languages. And that with a certain command code on the controller, you could actually get the Japanese game to run full English, with just like a cheat code, basically. which says something about how few people dived into the Virtual Boy back in the day, because I remember growing up, reading gaming magazines, and, there was a new game, this or that, for PlayStation or N64 or whatever it was, and people were having cheat codes and figuring out all the super secrets, like, within a day or a month, and in this case, it took almost 30 years, and especially for something so interesting and useful, because then suddenly the Japanese version isn't just the cheaper one, it becomes the playable one. Now, ironically, the supply and demand, it made the American versions fall in value and made the Japanese version rise in value. Not that this is, like, cheap now or that crazy expensive, it's just not as cheap as it used to be because of that. Where the American version is still ludicrously expensive, but not necessarily as bad as it once was. But yeah, that's a cool pickup to have for sure. If you ever, because, like, legit, I think that's the one I spent the most time with. I actually played a lot of that once I had this Virtual Boy, and I only had it for the last, like, year or two, and so that was the one I put the most time into. I thought that game was a lot of fun. I was like, okay, I kind of get the hype now by why that game was good. Got a few others. This is debatably the best game on the system, is Wario Land. This is a good game. I really wish I had this boxed. This is one of the few ones where the American version is actually cheaper than the Japanese version. I think the Japanese version had a very limited run, although I've seen it over there a few times. The American version wasn't exactly super common, but I guess it did sell a lot better over here, so as a result there are just more copies of it. But yeah, it's a good game. There's also Virtual League Baseball. This is one that's super common if you want the Japanese version. I don't have the Japanese version, but this is fine. But yeah, that's cool to have. Then I have a few, and this is kind of a common thing people do. So this is Nestor's Funky Bowling. You'll see it's got a custom case that's the artwork of the American style case, and it's using a 3DS case, appropriately enough, but it's using a 3DS like Greatest Hits or Platinum Choice case, which is red, so it looks really good. And inside you'll have these like foam covers that insert, and you can put the game in there. That was kind of a cool way, and this, of course, it says Nintendo on it because it was official from 3DS and everything. I think that's a cool, like, retroactive way to do it. And to that end, I have two more. I've got 3D Tetris. This one was, of course, an American exclusive. And infamously, Waterworld. I have that as well. Yeah, I've got Waterworld. But there are a few games I do not have, and we'll see if I ever get them. I'm not really actively trying to get a full Virtual Boy set or anything, but even without trying that hard, I'm mostly done, which should tell you a lot. These days, you can also get something like this. If you want to try the original hardware, this is like the Hyper Boy. There's a few different flash card options. This is the one I've got. Basically, the way it works is you connect it to a computer. I did a whole video on it where you just kind of, you can replace the ROM that's on it with like one of these or one of the fan-made games, etc. Which, by the way, there is an active fan community for it. In fact, there is a fan community that even made the infamous link cable. And I know that there's a Street Fighter game that was made that actually supports that. So you could have two Virtual Boys linked up together with this cable and that custom game. I don't know if any of the official games support that cable or not. Like, they might, because the idea was the cable would come, but I don't know if they actually did do that or not. But yeah, there's that. So, and the controller, I always kind of dug, because it's like halfway, it's like the cousin, the offspring of a GameCube and Super Nintendo controller. This is kind of how I look at it. It actually looks horrendous initially, but when you're holding it, it takes you a second, but while you're playing, you actually kind of get into it. It's not bad. It's also where the power switch is. It's just such a bizarre system. And that's what I think makes it so fascinating to me, at least now as an adult. Because now as an adult, I've actually taken more time, like a lot of us, to really appreciate like how weird it actually was, and the fact that Nintendo really tried to do this. And the fact that it's official. You know, I mean, people make fun of the Wii U for not being successful, but like, people knew what the Wii U was. People had it. This was just like, you know, snap your fingers and it was gone. Blink your eyes, it's gone. And it's just such a bizarre one. But again, it's received a lot of updates over years. Like now people are making replacements for the stand. They're making replacements for the eye part. You know, there's an infamous flaw in these things where some of the boards slightly disconnect. And there was people saying, oh, there's the oven method where you would cook it a little bit and that would fix it. Now there's like a proper install you do in there with a special board and everything that fixes the issue, because sometimes the system would basically disconnect. So the lens would look all messed up, or like one of the screens wouldn't work effectively. But yeah, I'm just glad to see that the fan community is still putting effort into this thing and getting stuff out there. And I just thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about it on its 30th anniversary. And I would have loved to have shown you some gameplay, but that's kind of the whole problem that even Nintendo had, is there's really not a way to do that with this thing, at least not properly. So I suggest unto you, if you don't have the actual hardware and you're curious about it, if you're brave enough, look into your 3DS if you have one. modify it per se, and run the Virtual Boy emulator on it, try out some of the games, and you'll realize like a taste of what we really could have had all the way back in the mid-90s, which is pretty cool. And also, it's just one of the little food for thought things here. For those who don't know, canonically, George Costanza of Seinfeld owns a Virtual Boy. There's an episode of Seinfeld where he's in his apartment. He's just wearing shorts. It might be like the Summer of George episode. And if you look around his room, and behind him at one point, there is a Virtual Boy just like out on the counter. And it seems very appropriate for his personality that the platform of choice for him would have been a Virtual Boy. Anywho, so that'll do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please do me a favor, like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, my travel channel, etc. Appreciate the support on all those platforms. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.